This is the story of Amara, a servant who dared to poison her billionaire master's tea. What happened next will shock you. But before we dive into this twisted tale of greed, betrayal, and redemption, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Amara had worked in the billionaire's palace for almost 3 years. The mansion was gigantic, marble floors that shone like mirrors, crystal chandeliers dangling from the ceiling, and walls covered in expensive paintings from across the world. To anyone who saw it from outside, it was a dream. But for Amara, it was a golden cage. She was one of the few servants who had been trusted with working inside the main house, close to the master himself. She had cleaned his study, prepared his meals, ironed his suits, and served his tea every single morning. And every morning, she watched him sit there in his silk robe, scrolling through his glowing tablet, sipping from the finest porcelain cups, while she stood quietly in the corner, waiting for him to finish so she could clear the table. But something had changed inside Amara. Every day, she watched the man grow richer, buying new cars, hosting extravagant parties, flaunting his power. And every day, she saw her own life stuck in the same cycle, cooking, cleaning, and working late nights with barely enough money to send home to her family. The mansion was filled with gold, but her room was small, barely large enough for a bed. Resentment grew inside her like a shadow that got darker with every sunrise. It was a cold morning when the thought first came to her. The billionaire had shouted at her the previous night, furious over a small mistake, a wine glass that wasn't polished enough for his liking. His anger echoed in her ears long after she left the dining hall. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her hands shook as she thought about the humiliation, the exhaustion, the endless cycle that never seemed to end. And then a voice inside her whispered, what if he was gone? What if everything changed? By morning, she had made up her mind. She prepared his tea as always. Hot water, carefully measured leaves, a hint of honey, just the way he liked it. But this time, she slipped in a small vial of poison she had secretly taken from the palace gardener's shed. Her heart was pounding so loudly, she was afraid the other servants would hear it. She placed the steaming cup on the silver tray, carried it to the billionaire's study, and set it down in front of him with a bow. The billionaire looked at her with his usual cold, dismissive eyes and reached for the cup. Time seemed to freeze. Amara held her breath, her palms sweating. Her mind was racing with images of him coughing, falling, the mansion falling silent. She imagined herself running away, free, never having to kneel before anyone again. But just as he raised the cup to his lips, he paused. He sniffed the tea. His eyes narrowed. Slowly, he put the cup down. Amara, he said in a calm, chilling voice that made her blood run cold. What did you put in this? Her heart stopped. For a second, she wanted to lie, to pretend nothing was wrong. But the billionaire's gaze was so sharp, it felt like it could cut through her soul. He knew. She could see it in his face. Poison, he said quietly, almost as if he was testing the word on his tongue. He didn't shout, didn't call for guards immediately. He just stared at her. Why? Amara froze. 1,000 emotions rushed through her, anger, fear, grief, rage, and yet no words came out. She opened her mouth, but her throat was dry. The billionaire pressed a button on his desk, and within seconds, 2 security guards appeared. Take her to the police, he ordered, his voice flat, emotionless. Amara struggled as they grabbed her by the arms, but she knew it was useless. She was dragged out of the mansion, down the long marble hallway she had walked so many times before, past the gleaming chandeliers and expensive paintings, and into the back of a black security vehicle. The drive to the police station felt endless. Her mind kept replaying the moment over and over, how close she had been, how one sip could have changed everything. She had failed, and now she was going to pay for it. The station was cold and smelled of metal and sweat. They threw her into a cell, a small concrete box with a single flickering light overhead. The bars clanged shut behind her, and she sank to the floor, her hands shaking. For hours, she sat there, listening to distant voices, the sound of doors opening and closing, footsteps echoing down the hallway. By midnight, the anger returned. Not fear, anger. Why should she be the one to suffer? She thought, why should he sit in his golden palace, untouched, while she rotted in a cell? Her heart hardened. When the guard came by later, He was half asleep. It wasn't difficult to trick him, to grab the keys when he wasn't looking. Her hands were steady this time, almost calm. She unlocked the cell door, slipped quietly down the hallway, and vanished into the night. She didn't run home. She didn't leave town. She didn't hide. She went back to the mansion. As she stood outside the gates, looking up at the massive palace glowing in the moonlight, she felt a strange calm wash over her. This time, she told herself she wouldn't fail. The night was eerily quiet as Amara stood at the massive iron gates of the billionaire's mansion. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the marble driveway and the perfectly trimmed gardens. The palace loomed ahead, glowing softly with its automated lights, like a sleeping beast that never really slept. Amara's breath came out in small, cold clouds. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no fear this time, just a cold determination that burned deeper than any fear could. She waited for a few minutes, watching the security cameras rotate slowly, memorizing their rhythm. She had lived here long enough to know where the blind spots were. Her feet carried her silently along the side wall, past the servant quarters, past the fountain that she used to clean every Monday morning. Her fingers brushed against the stone wall as she moved, almost as if she was saying goodbye to the house she once called her prison. When she reached the side entrance, she crouched low and waited. The electronic lock glowed faintly red. She remembered the code. She had entered it 100 times before while carrying trays of food and laundry baskets. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tapped the familiar pattern on the panel. The light turned green, and the door unlocked with a soft click. Inside, the air was warm, scented with polished wood and the faint smell of expensive perfume lingering in the halls. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the security system. She knew where every guard would be at this hour, 2 near the front hall, 1 patrolling the west wing, and 1 by the garage. None of them would expect her to come back, not after what had happened. She moved quickly but carefully, her footsteps almost soundless on the marble floor. Every hallway she passed carried memories, scrubbing floors until her knees ached, polishing doorknobs until her fingers went numb, serving drinks to guests who barely looked at her face. And now, here she was, not as a servant, but as something else, something dangerous. She stopped in front of the study. The heavy wooden door was slightly open, light spilling through the crack. She hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. The billionaire was there, sitting at his desk, the soft glow of his tablet lighting up his face. He didn't look surprised. "You came back," he said, his voice calm, almost casual, as though they were discussing the weather. Amara froze. For a moment, she wondered if he had been expecting her all along. Her mouth felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I came to apologize," she said, her voice low but steady. "I was angry, desperate. I thought killing you would solve everything. But I was wrong." He raised an eyebrow, still watching her carefully. "You poisoned me, Amara. Do you think words can erase that?" Her hands clenched at her sides. "I don't ask you to forget," she said. "Just let me stay. Let me work. I will never try to harm you again." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, studying her face. He saw no fear there, no tears, no pleading, just a strange, calm determination. "Why should I trust you?" he asked finally. "Because I came back," she said simply. "I could have run away, left the city forever. But I came here to face you." Something flickered in his expression, curiosity, maybe even a hint of respect. He stood slowly, walked around the desk, and stopped just a few feet away from her. "You know I could call the police right now," he said. "You could," Amara replied, "but you won't, because you're curious about what I'll do next." A faint smile crossed his lips. "You've grown bold, Amara." For a moment, they just stood there, facing each other, the powerful man and the servant who had once tried to kill him. Finally, he turned and walked back to his desk. "Fine," he said. "You will work here again. But if you make one mistake, one wrong move, you won't get a second chance." Amara bowed her head slightly. "I understand." But inside, her heart was a storm. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't redemption. This was an opportunity. She had convinced him to let her stay, and that meant she had another chance. The next morning, the mansion came alive again. The other servants were shocked to see Amara back. Some whispered behind her back, others avoided her completely, but she ignored them all. She went about her duties quietly, cleaning, cooking, serving tea, just as before. From the outside, it seemed as if nothing had changed. But inside her, everything had changed. Every time she entered the kitchen, every time she held a knife to chop vegetables, every time she prepared his tea, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She would smile politely when he spoke to her, nod respectfully when he gave an order, and all the while, she was planning. At night, when the mansion was quiet and the other servants were asleep, she would sit in her room, staring at the ceiling, going over every detail in her mind, how she would get close enough, how she would strike, how she would make sure, this time, there would be no mistake. Days turned into weeks. Amara became almost invisible, moving silently through the halls, doing her work without complaint. The billionaire began to trust her again, just as she knew he would. He stopped watching her so closely, stopped questioning her presence. And that was exactly what she wanted. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen, the knife in her hand gleamed under the light. She felt its weight, its sharpness, the power it gave her. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished blade, and for a moment, she almost didn't recognize herself. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect moment came on a night when the mansion was quieter than usual. There were no guests, no parties, no meetings. The billionaire was in his study, reading reports on his glowing tablet, and the other servants had all retired early to their quarters. The air was still, heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint hum of electronics. Amara stood in the kitchen, her heart beating so loudly she could almost hear it echoing off the marble counters. The knife lay in her hand, heavy, sharp, glinting under the soft kitchen lights. She closed her fingers around the handle and felt an electric chill run through her. This was it. Weeks of pretending, of smiling, of acting obedient and quiet. It had all led to this moment. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. Her reflection in the steel refrigerator stared back at her. Her face looked pale, her eyes dark and burning. This was not the Amara who had first entered this mansion 3 years ago. That girl had been timid, shy, desperate to please. This Amara was something else entirely. She moved quietly through the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. Every sound seemed louder tonight, the faint creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the antique clock, the low hum of a security system. She felt like the house itself was watching her, holding its breath. When she reached the study door, she paused. Light spilled out from underneath. She could hear the faint rustle of paper, the soft tap of keys. Slowly, carefully, she pushed the door open. The billionaire was there, just as she expected. He sat behind his desk, dressed in a dark robe, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked tired but focused, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. Amara stepped into the room, the knife hidden behind her back. "Sir," she said softly. He looked up, surprised to see her so late. "What is it, Amara?" She stepped closer, her pulse pounding in her ears. I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice calm, "for giving me another chance." A faint smile touched his lips. "You've been working well," he said. "I was beginning to think you meant what you said." She forced a small smile, nodding. "I did mean it." But as she stood there, watching him, all the old anger surged back, the shouting, the endless hours of work, the humiliation, the way he had dragged her to the police like she was nothing. Her grip on the knife tightened. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I was impressed that you came back that night. Not many people have that kind of courage." Courage. The word echoed in her head like a challenge. She stepped forward, and then in one swift motion, she brought the knife out from behind her back and lunged. But the billionaire was faster than she expected. He had seen it coming. Maybe he had been expecting this moment all along. He twisted out of his chair, the blade slicing through the air where he had been sitting just a second ago. The chair toppled over, crashing to the floor. "Amara!" he shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. She didn't stop. She swung again, the knife flashing under the light. The billionaire grabbed the edge of the desk and shoved it between them, blocking her strike. The knife slammed into the wooden surface, sticking there for a moment before she yanked it free. "Put it down!" he barked. But she was breathing hard now, her face twisted with fury. "You ruined my life," she shouted. "You made me nothing." He didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, focused, like a predator staring down its prey. "No, Amara," he said slowly. "You ruined your own life the moment you let hate control you." His words hit her like a slap. For a moment, she froze, her chest heaving, the knife trembling in her hand. "You think this will set you free," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady. "Killing me won't free you. It will destroy you." Her grip faltered. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and angry. "I just wanted to be respected," she whispered. "And you think this is the way?" he asked, gesturing at the knife. "Respect isn't taken with blood, Amara. It's earned." For a long moment, the room was silent, except for her ragged breathing. The knife felt suddenly heavy, too heavy. Her hand shook, and slowly, it slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. She fell to her knees, her sobs breaking the tense silence. The billionaire didn't move for a moment. He just stood there, watching her cry, his face unreadable. Finally, he walked over, picked up the knife, and set it on the desk. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "Leave this house. Leave this life. Start over somewhere far from here. Or stay, and this time you won't get another chance." Amara looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. For the first time, she saw not just power in his face, but something else. Maybe pity, maybe understanding. She nodded slowly. Without another word, she got up, wiped her face, and walked out of the study. Her footsteps echoed down the long hallway as she left the mansion for the last time. The night air was cold when she stepped outside. The gates stood open, as if inviting her to go. For a moment, she turned back to look at the palace, glowing silently under the moon. Then, she walked away. The cold night air wrapped around Amara like a blanket, but it was not comforting. It was biting, sharp, almost punishing. Her footsteps crunched softly on the gravel as she walked away from the glowing palace behind her. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the entire evening, the knife, the confrontation, the tears, was pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't have a plan. She just walked. The streets beyond the mansion were quiet, almost eerily so. The city lights shimmered in the distance like a sea of stars, but they felt so far away. For the first time in years, Amara was truly alone. No mansion, no guards, no locked cell, no orders being barked at her. Just her, and the sound of her own breathing. At first, her mind was a storm. Every memory played back. The humiliation of being dragged to the police, the long nights in the cell, the way the billionaire's voice had sounded when he told her she had ruined her own life. The words echoed in her ears like a haunting melody she couldn't escape. Was he right? She hated admitting it. But deep down, something inside her whispered that he was. It hadn't just been him. It hadn't just been the way he treated her. Somewhere along the way, she had allowed anger to take control of her, to twist her thoughts until the only solution she could see was violence. And when she had stood in front of him tonight, knife in hand, she hadn't felt powerful. She had felt empty. The thought made her stop in her tracks. She stood there, in the middle of the quiet road, breathing hard, her eyes burning. And then, slowly, she sank down onto the curb. For the first time since she had escaped the police station, she allowed herself to cry. Not angry tears, not desperate tears, but deep, aching sobs that seemed to tear something open inside her. She buried her face in her hands and wept until her throat was raw. When she finally lifted her head, the night felt different. The anger that had driven her for so long was still there, but it no longer burned with the same fire. It was like a coal, cooling slowly in the darkness. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. She didn't know exactly what to do, but she knew one thing. She couldn't go back. Not to the mansion. Not to her old life. If she stayed there, she would keep circling the same fire forever. She needed to leave this place behind, leave everything behind, if she ever wanted to feel free. So she walked again. By morning, she had made it to the outskirts of a city. The skyline behind her glowed faintly in the early light, and ahead of her stretched open fields and distant villages. Her body ached from the long night, her clothes were dusty, and her feet throbbed, but she didn't stop. She found a small path that led toward the countryside and followed it until the city noise faded completely. Eventually, she reached a village, a quiet, humble place with mud brick houses, narrow dirt roads, and children playing barefoot near the well. The smell of cooking fires filled the air, and roosters crowed in the distance. No one here knew her name. No one knew what she had done. She stood at the edge of the village for a long time watching. And then, cautiously, she stepped forward. Over the next few days, she stayed near the village, sleeping outside under the stars, eating whatever scraps of food she could trade for small tasks, carrying water, sweeping yards, helping an old woman repair her fence. At first, the villagers were suspicious of her. She looked tired, worn, like someone who had seen too much. But slowly, they began to warm up to her. One morning, a farmer offered her a place to stay in exchange for helping with the fields. The work was hard, harder even than the mansion, but it was different. Here, no one shouted at her. No one looked down on her. Every seed she planted, every basket of vegetables she carried, was for a purpose she could see and touch. And slowly, something inside her began to heal. Weeks passed. The rage that had consumed her began to feel like a distant memory, something that belonged to another life. She still thought about the mansion sometimes, about the man who had given her a second chance only for her to throw it away. But now, when she thought of him, there was no fire in her chest, only a quiet sadness, and perhaps a strange gratitude. One evening, she sat under the shade of a large tree, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The fields stretched out before her, ready for harvest. She realized that, for the first time in years, she felt at peace. She didn't know what her future would look like, but she knew it wouldn't be built on revenge. That night, as the stars came out and the village settled into quiet, Amara whispered softly into the darkness, as though speaking to someone far away. "I'm done fighting," she said. "I'm done being angry. I will not waste my life chasing vengeance. I will build something new." The wind rustled through the trees as if answering her, and for the first time in a very long time, Amara smiled. Amara sat beneath the tree long after the stars had filled the sky. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves. For a long time, she simply stayed there, breathing in the cool air, feeling the rough bark against her back. The anger that had once consumed her was gone now, replaced by a strange kind of calm. But as peaceful as the night felt, a thought began to creep into her mind, a thought that wouldn't let her rest. She realized she had never truly closed the chapter of her past. She had walked away from the mansion, from the man who had once been her master, from the life that had nearly destroyed her, but she had never really faced what she had done. She had apologized that night, yes, but the words had been empty, just part of her plan to get close to him again. Now, for the first time, she wanted to mean them. The idea scared her. The thought of going back, of seeing him again, made her stomach twist. But deep inside, she knew she had to. Not for him, for herself. 2 days later, as the sun began to rise over the fields, Amara gathered what little she had. A small bag of clothes, a piece of bread for the road, and began the long walk back toward the city. Each step felt heavy, not with anger this time, but with resolve. By the time she reached the city gates, her feet ached and her throat was dry, but she didn't stop. The streets felt louder, busier than she remembered. The noise of vendors, the rumble of hover cars, the smell of street food and smoke, it was overwhelming after weeks of quiet village life. But she pressed on. When she finally stood outside the mansion once more, her breath caught in her throat. It looked just as it always had. Towering walls, gleaming gates, security drones hovering lazily in the air. For a long moment, she just stood there, gripping the straps of her bag, feeling her heart pound. Then she stepped forward and pressed the buzzer. The gate slid open after a moment, and a guard approached. His eyes widened slightly when he recognized her. "You again," he said sharply. "I need to speak to him," Amara said quietly. The guard hesitated, then spoke into his earpiece. After a pause, he nodded and stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said. As she walked up the long driveway, her heart felt like it might break through her chest. The mansion loomed larger with every step, a place full of memories, both bitter and haunting. When she reached the front door, it opened automatically, and a servant she didn't recognize led her to the study. The billionaire was there, standing by the window, looking out at the gardens. When he turned, his expression was calm, unreadable. "Amara," he said simply. "I wasn't sure I would see you again." She stood there for a moment, gripping her bag tightly, her throat dry. And then she said the words she had been carrying all this way. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not for being caught. Not for failing. I'm sorry for letting anger turn me into something I'm not. I wanted to hurt you, to make you pay. But all I did was hurt myself." The room was silent. The billionaire studied her for a long moment, his face thoughtful. Finally, he walked over to his desk and sat down, gesturing for her to sit as well. "You came all the way back just to say that?" he asked. "Yes," Amara said softly. "I don't want anything from you. Not a job, not forgiveness. I needed to end this. To leave knowing I didn't let hate win." For the first time, something softened in his expression. "You've changed," he said quietly. Amara nodded. "I had to." He leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "You know," he said slowly, "I could still call the police. You escaped custody. By law, you should still be in prison." Amara met his eyes steadily. "If that's what you want to do, I won't fight it. But I had to come here first." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And then, slowly, the billionaire shook his head. "No," he said. "I won't call them. You've already punished yourself more than prison ever could." Relief washed over Amara, but she didn't smile. She simply nodded and stood. "Thank you," she said. As she turned to leave, the billionaire's voice stopped her. "Amara!" She turned back, waiting. "Where will you go now?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "Somewhere far from here," she said finally. "Somewhere I can build a life that doesn't feel like a cage." He nodded once, then turned back to the window. Amara left the mansion for the last time. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Not the kind that comes from running away, but the kind that comes from facing the truth and letting go. The road stretched ahead of her, long and uncertain, but she was not afraid. With every step, she felt lighter, as though she was shedding the past piece by piece. By the time she reached the edge of the city, the sun was high and warm on her face. She stopped for a moment, looking back one last time. The mansion was barely visible in the distance now, just a shape on the horizon. And then she turned and kept walking, toward a future that was hers to write.